And I want to thank all of you for being here today, and for anyone who's watching this. This is an important topic. A lot of people think that economics is boring. They look upon it as a terribly boring subject. I don't agree. I believe economics is fascinating. I mean, economics is what determines living standards. And I often wondered, why was I so concerned about living standards? And somehow it seems to me that I could trace the origins back to discussions that I used to have with my grandmother when I was a teenager. She would tell me about what life was like when she was a young lady. She was a young lady in the eastern Ukraine at the beginning of the 1900s. And when she would tell me about the conditions there, she would explain how poor they were, and her whole demeanor changed. She became sad when she thought about how difficult it was to find work. Many times she often had to walk 5 miles, 6 miles, whatever. And she said on the rare occasions when she was able to find some work, it was very poor, low pay. And then when she would tell me about coming to this country, she would brighten up. Her eyes would sparkle. And she said, I could not believe what I found in this country. I was able to get a job during the day. I was able to get a second job at night, and I had a third job on the weekend. She says, this was paradise. This was heaven, at least compared to what she had known. Now, I tried to calculate, as a result of a lot of the data I did for Rich Nation, Poor Nation, what was she paid? She didn't have any skills. She didn't know the language. She had the most menial job you can get. She made, I think, less than 5 cents an hour in the U.S. Now, 5 cents an hour went a lot further when she was getting that job. So I updated it to today's currency so we could relate to it. It's about 75 cents an hour. And I just thank God that we didn't have the, quote, benefit of a minimum wage in effect at that time, because she would have been priced out of all 3 jobs. And I believe the whole history of our family would have been very different. Well, it was the story and the incidents of talking to my grandmother that made me think about the most important question in economics, bar none. Why is it that some nations prosper and other nations fail? That's the most important question in economics. And if you ask economists this question, you basically get 2 types of answers. One type, economists will tell you, well, it's because of resources. If a country has a lot of resources, or if it has a lot of innovators, people who are innovating and inventing things, and creating things. Or they say, if any of these conditions don't exist, maybe government spending can really create prosperity in a country. Maybe if you invest in the right areas, the right inventions, you'll be able to get ahead. That's one answer that economists have given to this very important question. There was another answer, an answer that was given by the 2 most famous economists in history, Adam Smith and Milton Friedman. They said, really, the key to the wealth of nations is giving people economic freedom and control over their lives. What do we mean by economic freedom? Well, Adam Smith said the government should be limited. Why limit the government? Because then most of the activity in the economy comes from the private sector. He said taxes should be low. That gives individuals the economic freedom to control most of their earnings from their hard-earned labor. Markets should be free to adjust, so what we buy and the prices all reflect what individuals really want. And regulation should be minimal. This is the nature of economic freedom. And what Adam Smith said is, if you provide people with this economic freedom, you will have the greatest amount of goods and services produced for the greatest number of people. So, I thought if the 2 most famous economists in history were saying these things, maybe it would be a good idea to pay attention to what they were saying. And the interesting thing about both these economists is the way they were trying to persuade people about economic freedom. Adam Smith pointed out the conditions in America and the colonies and said, because these colonies have more freedom, one day they will grow and they will be more prosperous than the United Kingdom. And he said, but in Latin America, where they don't have freedom, where you have oppression, he said, that will not be as strong. And Milton Friedman, how many of you remember in 1980, Milton Friedman had a whole series called Free to Choose, where he had videotapes. And as part of the research for my book, I went back to those videotapes. I saw what Friedman would do is he'd go to different countries and point to prosperity and say, this country is prosperous, say Japan, because they allow more freedom than another country, say India. And then he would have a discussion, a half-hour discussion with people who disagreed with him, people who thought the government was responsible. And they would come up and say, well, Professor Friedman, Japan also has a lot of government intervention, and we think it's the government intervention that's causing the prosperity in Japan. So what was it? Well, there was a flaw. Using anecdotes simply wasn't as powerful as trying to come up with an objective measure of economic freedom. And being the genius that he was, Milton Friedman knew that. He knew there was a flaw in trying to convince people. So he met with the Fraser Institute in Canada in the late 1980s and into the 90s. They developed objective measures of economic freedom so they can compare one country's freedom to another, and you can compare what was happening to economic freedom over time. And these measures have been around for a while now. In some cases, they've been around for about 45 years. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great to do a study that looked at all these measures of economic freedom over time and then looked at what was happening to living standards in the different countries. This could potentially be a really powerful contribution. Now, it isn't that economists haven't paid any attention to these measures of economic freedom. They have, but you know what economists do? They write for other economists. They do a highly statistical study with a lot of data and a lot of things that no one understands, including the other economists. And so people still don't know what the relationship is. And I thought, wow, I want to put together a relationship between these measures of economic freedom, both here in the United States and abroad, and see what happens to living standards below it so that everyone can clearly see what happens and what the relationship is. And then I thought, well, there's a problem here. I have a bias in the direction of economic freedom. I've written 4 books promoting the whole idea, explaining why, as Adam Smith and Milton Friedman said, that giving people economic freedom promotes prosperity. There's a problem when you have a bias and you want to start a research study, because there's the tendency to just look at the data until, torture it until it finally screams, you're right, I should have known that all along. So one thing, if a study is going to be any good, you have to do is you have to make sure that it's an honest, unbiased study. And so I had to ask myself, can you really do an unbiased study? And I told myself, yes. And the reason I told myself and convinced myself I would be able to do it was, first of all, I believe that's the only sort of study that is worth doing in the first place. But secondly, there were a lot of things I did not know about the relationship between economic freedom and living standards. I talked about the concepts in all of my books, and that's what Friedman talked about, and that's what Adam Smith talked about. What I wanted to do was talk about the evidence. What was the evidence? I didn't know the evidence. To what extent was economic freedom associated with higher living standards? To what extent was it not associated with higher living standards? Was it different in history as it is in the current period? Is it different for countries abroad than it is for our country? There were a host of unanswered questions that I lined up. And I said, I really want to know the answer to these questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look closely at all the data. And here, I really lucked out because I had all these data on economic freedom that had been developed by the Fraser Institute and some by the Heritage Institute in Washington, D.C. And then I had to start to collect data on living standards in different countries. And here's where I really lucked out. because there was a great British economist by the name of Angus Madison who had gone back and diligently tried to estimate and comparable data for living standards in all the countries of the world, going back to the birth of Christ. An unbelievable undertaking. And his book was available. You could actually get the book with all these data in it. So I had the data for all the countries that I needed. Now that data ended about 2000. But other researchers, hundreds of researchers, perhaps thousands, statisticians, researchers, picked up on his work and updated the numbers to the current period. So I had to make them all comparable, put them all together. Everything was finally done, and I had all the data. Now, the next thing I had to do was put the data together in some sort of concrete form so that people can understand it. And I wanted to start really going back to the beginning of time, or more closely, more accurately, the beginning of recorded history. I wanted to focus continually on what was the economic situation of the typical worker, the middle income, perhaps slightly lower income working individual. And I went back, and I couldn't go back past the birth of Christ, at least not as far as Madison's data were concerned, but I went back to ancient Egypt and started to research what were people like, what was their living standard like in ancient Egypt. And then I knew that living standards hadn't increased from the birth of Christ up to the Middle Ages, so I already knew that. And then I went into a description of what people's living standards were like, the typical worker, in the Middle Ages. And lo and behold, I found they were no different in the Middle Ages than they had been in ancient Egypt. We had gone 4,000 years with no significant increase in living standards. And remember, there were a lot of innovations, a lot of inventions in this period. What does that tell me? That tells me that this idea that innovations and inventions is the key to increasing living standards was simply not true. Then what I had to do is I had to decide where do I want to start. And I decided I would start looking at the U.S. economy. Because what happened was, as you get to the end of the Middle Ages, you finally start to see economic freedom beginning to appear in England, certain parts of Europe. And for the first time in recorded history, you start to see some slight increases in people's living standards. But then what happened is the United States country, our country, was created. A unique experiment, an experiment creating a country based on the assumption that people should have the maximum amount of freedom and control over their lives so long as they don't harm anyone else. This was a unique experiment. And what happens as a result of this unique experiment? People from all over the world get attracted to the United States. And lo and behold, within a little more than a century, the United States living standards pass those of the UK, fulfilling Adam Smith's bold prediction of what would eventually happen in the United States. What I did then is I picked up the study in 1900. I said, I'm going to go from 1900 to 2015, and I'm going to look at living standards in the United States. And I had to collect a vast amount of data. Most of our data goes back only to 1929 from the official government reports. You have to dig into historical data to go back a little further, but I felt that it was important for a couple of reasons. Because I wanted a long span of history. And there was an important question about the role of government. You know, we have had made great progress in terms of economic activity in the United States in that period of time. But that period of time was also marked by a tremendous increase in government spending. So an awful lot of people suggested that the increase in government spending was played a key role in that increase in living standard. Well, I wanted to see if this was the case. And what I had to do is I had to come up with a measure of economic freedom, because I wanted to look at the performance of the economy in different periods based on economic policies of freedom. Now, we didn't have measures of economic freedom, but I had to take the components that I felt were most relevant. So what I did is I took the characteristics of a free market period, which I objectively set up ahead of time, would be where federal spending is growing at a slower rate than spending in the rest of the economy. So the private sector is expanding. I said a period of economic freedom will be one where tax rates are low, or if they were high at the beginning of the period and they were declining, that would be a period when we move toward economic freedom. Or when free markets were allowed to be pretty much prevalent, or if the markets had been restrained when we were taking those restraints off, or if business and individuals were being regulated, we would be reducing the regulations. Those were the free market periods. I call that free market classical periods. But they were basically periods where we were moving in the direction of economic freedom. The opposite of those is when federal spending is increasing faster than spending in the rest of the economy. So the private sector is shrinking. When tax rates are rising, when there are more restraints being put on free markets, and where there are also more restraints being put on business. So now I had my criteria. I felt this is what the progressive economic policy agenda is over here. And this is the policy, these are the policies that are associated with economic freedom. So I had this, then I went back through history. And I started to lop off periods based on what was happening in the periods. And interestingly enough, I came up with 5 periods in our history which were dominated by the move toward economic freedom, and 5 periods in history that were dominated by the progressive economic agenda when we were moving away from economic freedom. The 5 periods of economic freedom totaled only 50 years. The periods when we were moving away totaled 52 years over this period. There were also 13 years, the World War II, Korean War periods, when we had dramatic changes associated with the war that I simply argued were ambivalent periods. Now, I was in for a couple of shocks when I put together my periods of economic policy performance and the data that I looked at. The first shock was when I looked at my criteria, I found out that all of these forces, all 4, moved in the same direction. That is, when government spending was being cut, taxes were being reduced, regulations were being cut, and markets were being created that were freer than before, and vice versa. I thought I would have a very difficult time kind of delineating the policy periods, and that didn't occur. And that was my first surprise. My second surprise dealt with what was happening to my measure of economic activity. Now, I have a lot of measures of economic activity. Most of the results are in the appendix. But what I focused on primarily in the main part of the book was the wages of the typical worker, the average wages of a typical worker. And my best estimate for that was the take-home pay of the average worker. I felt that that was really going to be characteristic of what this middle income, maybe lower income worker was experiencing during these cycles. And the shock that really struck me was when I added up all the increases in wages, and there were a lot of them. For example, for the whole period, the period 1900, I found this fascinating. The annual wage after taxes of an average wage worker was $400. Now, again, we had a lot of inflation, so I had to adjust the wages. And the wages adjusted for inflation, so you can see it in today's dollars, $11,600 was the annual wage for a typical worker after taxes. In 2015, it's $38,000. A 230% increase in real wages. That's about a 1% a year increase in after-tax wages over history. Now, that wasn't the shock. The shock was when I added up all the wage increases in the 52 years that we were following the progressive economic agenda, the total increase was 0. That was the shock. At that point, I sat back and I said, something's wrong. And I had to go, I had to take a break, go back, look at the data. I knew that progressive economic policies were not good. I knew that from theory. I knew that from experience. I did not realize that it was that bad. So I went back, redid the data, read it again and again, trying to find out, is this, and it kept coming out the same way. Turns out 87% of that huge increase in wages in the period from 1900 to 2015 came about during the periods characterized by economic freedom. And the remainder, the 13% that remains, all came about in that World War II, Korean War period when the policies were going in both directions, quickly changing from one to the other. So that was the most shocking development. And then, of course, when I got that shocking development, I couldn't help thinking what I think most people should be thinking: what if after that first period what if we had never experimented with the progressive economic agenda? That is, what if we never had the Wilson years, you never had the 1930 or 1940 period? What if we just had classical policies? And what I did, obviously hypothetical, I went to each period of progressive economic policies, like 1913 to 1920, and I took the average wage performance in the previous period when the classical free market policies were in effect. And I simply generated a series to see, I'm just curious, what would our wages be today? The average after-tax wage today with that sort of analysis would be $114,000. That's average take-home pay. Now, of course, we wouldn't have an income tax, so no, everything changes. And then what I did is I said, what if, after that first progressive period, from 1913 to 1920, we never returned to our classical roots? What would have happened? And so I did the exact opposite. From 1920 to 1929, instead of allowing the roaring 20s to occur, I simply took the average wage performance in the previous progressive period. And I continued to generate that throughout. If we forget about the World War II, Korean War years, what happens is in 2015, the average wage becomes $16,000, which incidentally was exactly what it was in 1913. That is, there is no increase in real wages. Now, I understand this is a hypothetical type of analysis. However, when I go through and analyze what's happening in the rest of the world, what is hypothetical for the US is reality in the rest of the world. When I look at the measures of economic freedom in my book, and I look at living standards, and I see in Latin America we have relatively low measures of economic freedom, according to the Fraser data. Latin American incomes are far lower than the US. And when you go to Africa and you see measures of economic freedom, they're about as low as you can imagine. What do you find? You find the lowest living standards there. And I started to look at one country after another country after another country, going through trying to research and analysis of what was happening to their economic policies at the time. And country after country, I start seeing the same relationship. And then I start looking at changes. Well, what happens when they change and they have a high rating and they go to a low rating of economic freedom? What happens to their living standards? Lo and behold, their living standards go up. When they have a high rate of economic freedom to a low rate of economic, the living standards go down. And you can see the problems that are occurring. So I'm looking at these data, and then I'm saying, okay, this is coming out too well, and remember, you're supposed to be objective. So let me try and search and find where it doesn't work and try and figure out why it doesn't work. And there were a couple of countries where I thought I had discovered it's not working. And the more I looked at it, the more I went in and found out about those countries, found out about where they were when they started to adopt policies of economic freedom, the more apparent it came that no, that was not an exception. The only exception I think I might have found is Jordan in the Middle East has a pretty high economic freedom rating, and their living standards are not that great. But when you look at the environment, the chaos that surrounds Jordan, yes, it is possible that the relationship, you won't get prosperity if you're in the middle of a war zone and you have all that chaos going around. But that's about the only one I've found so far. I've done about 40 countries. I'll be doing the rest of the world because I believe you can learn more if you find something that doesn't work than from finding all these things that work, because then you want to know why it didn't work. Well, let me wrap things up because I would like to get to questions, but as part of the conclusion, I want to make just a kind of personal observation. I went through mounds of data for this book, and very often I got consumed by the data, I got lost, and I just want to recognize my wife, Maureen, who happens to be with us. She had to put up with this, and I don't know how many times she would come in after meeting with her friends and say, the most important question my friends had is, do I really have a husband? Or is he just some figment of your imagination? Well, I think I'll wrap it up by saying, what did this figment of her imagination end up accomplishing with all this work? And it didn't dawn on me at first because, again, I was enmeshed in the data. But as I kind of sat back and started looking at one chart after another and one write-up of one chapter after another, I sat back and I said, wow, what did I do? I said, I think what I did is to really verify, not that Adam Smith and Milton Friedman were correct, but the extent to which they were correct. And I don't know about them, and we can't ask them now, but for me, this relationship worked far better than I could ever have imagined. That is, they were far more correct than I would have ever given them credit for. I mean, this stuff was great. And got me to thinking, we still have people who are advocating the progressive economic agenda. It's really making a comeback. People are talking about increasing government spending in order to stimulate the economy, increasing it faster than spending in the rest of the economy. They're arguing against trickle-down economics, which incidentally has only worked and succeeded every time it's been tried in history. I mean, there are people who are arguing for a minimum wage, a government-imposed minimum wage, instead of allowing the economy to grow and for people to prosper. I mean, the progressive economic agenda is still alive and well. And frankly, I would say to anyone who is pursuing those economic policies that what I'd like them to do is I'd really like them to look closely at the evidence in this book. Look closely at it. Go back, get your own numbers. The numbers are all readily available on economic freedom and living standards. If you want, I can help you with some calculations because there are a lot of difficult calculations. I'm more than happy to give you my data to see. They're out in the open for everyone to see. Because I guarantee you, if you look at this information, if you look at this evidence, you'll come to the conclusion that I came to, that when you promote policies that move away from economic freedom, what you are really promoting is poverty, and what you are really undermining is the economic condition of the middle class. So I have that's my challenge to people. Now, for those of you, many in this room, who agree with the concept of economic freedom, kind of knew instinctively that this was something that works. Let me just say that I think it works to a far greater extent than I would ever have imagined. And what we have to do now, and I need your help for this, is we have to get the word out. We have to spread the word that there is solid evidence here. Solid evidence that really is going to make the difference between prosperity and poverty in some of the countries of the world. And if we can get that evidence out, I think that we can really change the world for the better. So what would I like you to do? I'd like you to read the book. I'd like you to become familiar with all the evidence that's in this book, because there's an awful lot of it, far more than I can talk about in a brief presentation. I'd like you to go to libraries, bookstores, request it. Just ask them to get it in. If you don't want to buy it, go to the library and read it off the library. Mention the book to others, to your friends and associates. I have some people have told me that they bought multiple copies for their clients or for their employees. This is important information. We have to get the word out. If you can recommend someone look at this video to get an overview of this, please do that. But I believe that we are on the verge of making some very important decisions in this country that'll affect our future. And countries around the world are always making the same decisions. And if they can understand the research and the evidence behind the power of economic freedom, they're going to make much better decisions than they otherwise would.